Federalist 41, Part 2. We'll start with paragraph 5. We had very short paragraphs here. That we may form a correct judgment on this subject, it will be proper to review the several powers conferred on the government of the Union, and that this may be the more conveniently done, they may be reduced into different classes as they relate to the following different objects. 1. Security against foreign danger. 2. Regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations. 3. Maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. 4. Certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. 5. Restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. 6. Provisions for giving due efficacy to all those powers. The powers falling within the first class are those of declaring war and granting letters of marque, of providing armies and fleets, of regulating and calling forth the militia, of levying and borrowing money. Security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of the civil society. Primitive objects means primary, the most important. It is an avowed and essential object of the American Union. The powers requisite for attaining it must be effectually confided to the Federal Council. So if security against foreign danger is one of the most important things that a government does, then it has to have enough power to get that done. Now, next paragraph. Is the power of declaring war necessary? No man will answer this question in the negative. It would be superfluous, therefore, to enter into a proof of the affirmative. The existing Confederation establishes this power in the most ample form. Is the power of raising armies and equipping fleets necessary? This is involved in the foregone power. It is involved in the power of self-defense. But was it necessary to give an independent power of raising troops as well as providing fleets and of maintaining both in peace as well as in war? So here is the part that he brings up, because again, anti-federalists are saying, why do you need a standing army or a big navy when we are in peace? The answer to these questions has been too far anticipated in another place to admit an extensive discussion of them in this place. The answer indeed seems to be so obvious and conclusive as scarcely to justify such a discussion in any place. With what color of propriety could the force necessary for defense be limited by those who cannot limit the force of offense? If a federal constitution could chain the ambition or set bounds to the exertions of all other nations, then indeed might it prudently chain the discretion of its own government and set bounds to the exertions for its own safety. He says, yes, we might limit our defenses, but that's if our enemy is kind enough to do theirs. So enemy, by definition, they're not going to do that. They're going to stay strong. So you have to constantly expect the unexpected. You don't want them surprise attack. You don't want them to overwhelm you. So you always have to have a certain degree of readiness, a certain degree of army and a navy to defend yourself. You can't just wait for the war to happen and then try to organize a military. These are the same things that Hamilton had said earlier in one of the earlier Federalists. How could a readiness for war in time of peace be safely prohibited, unless we could prohibit in like manner the preparations and establishments of every hostile nation? The means of security can only be regulated by the means and the danger of attack. They will in fact be ever determined by these rules and by no others. It is in vain to oppose constitutional barriers to the impulse of self-preservation. It is worse than in vain, because it plants in the Constitution itself necessary usurpations of power, every precedent of which is a germ of unnecessary and multiplied repetitions. If one nation maintains constantly a disciplined army ready for service of ambition or revenge, it obliges the most pacific nations, peaceful nations, who may be within the reach of its enterprise, to take corresponding precautions. Remember, in this paragraph, he refers to something that Hamilton had said, or they had said earlier. They said, you don't ever want to write your constitution in a way where when emergencies arise, those to whom you've given the defense of your country will be obliged to overreach and overstep their bounds and maybe even violate the Constitution because of the name of your safety. It says if you do this, if you let people be forced to do this, then gradually they will not respect the Constitution at all. That's why it's better to have a small standing army, trained army, and a navy. This way, we won't be so shocked and surprised that we have to violate the Constitution to defend ourselves. The 15th century was the unhappy epoch of military establishments in time of peace. They were introduced by Charles VII of France. All Europe has followed or been forced into the example. Had the example not been followed by other nations, all Europe must long ago have worn the chains of a universal monarch. Were every nation except France now to disband its peace establishment, the same event might follow. The veteran legions of Rome were an overmatch for the undisciplined valor of all other nations, and rendered her mistress of the world. It says, look at what happened in Europe. When France under Charles VII started a big army, a big military, all those peaceful nations around the edges, around it, had to be armed and ready, because France would have put a chain around their necks and would have dominated them more than it already has. And he says the same. If all those countries around France were not armed at this time, they would have to do the same thing. And at the end, he says, look, Rome was not huge at first, but it had a very disciplined military. And with that disciplined military, it was an outmatch for valor and courage of an undisciplined army of another country. And that's how Rome became the mistress of the world, started mastery of the world. So we in America should also learn our lesson. These anti-federalists that they say, why do you need any standing army, should beware, because if we don't have a small army, disciplined army, and a disciplined navy, then any weak power can actually invade us, and at that time it would be too late to organize.